Good afternoon. On behalf of the Trulas College of Business and our partners at MU Extension and Engagement, welcome to this, our seventh offering of the Trulas Business Insider Series. My name is Ajay Vinze, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as Dean of the Trulas College of Business. Today's session is being moderated by Lathan Ferguson. Lathan is a member of our Trulas College of Business Advancement Group. The presentation and discussion today is certainly most timely, and I'm thrilled to be here participating in it with you. The focus today commemorates Black History Month, and I'm delighted that Dr. Miller W. Boyd III is with us to discuss African American business and community development in St. Louis from 1765 to the present day. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Lathan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Vince. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. So I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Miller Boyd. And so it's just so serendipitous, right? As we conclude Black History Month, thought it would be great to do it and to end the month with a topic that ties business and education into one another, and how once we leave this wonderful university, right, how it shows up in the world. So Dr. Miller Boyd III is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. He received his bachelor's degree in sociology from Xavier University in Louisiana. From there, he went on to obtain his master's of African American studies at Boston University, and then concluded his educational journey, although he is an eternal student, but he concluded his formal educational journey with a PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. He is currently an educator in the St. Louis, Missouri area for Whitfield High School College Preparatory, and he is the proud father of some wonderful children. His concentration in his research areas are 18th and 19th century African American history, Civil War history, race identity and slavery in American Gulf Coast, African American 19th century labor history, and Atlantic world history. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Miller Boyd III. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Mr. Ferguson, if you could put those slides up, and then we'll be ready to go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. The confines of African American history have often been relegated to stories about a select cadre of Black luminaries whose names are invoked every February. The problem is that a myopic focus on Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman keeps us from learning about other dynamic figures whose stories serve as an instructive for the present generation. Recognizing and understanding and being familiar with African American history is beneficial to you both professionally and personally. It helps you to understand the diversity of the American experience, and it provides opportunity for collaboration to make this state, this region, and this country better. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about African American St. Louis. We'll talk about entrepreneurship, business, labor, and community development. Now, African American history in Missouri stretches back about 300 years, beginning when French explorer Philippe Francois Renaud brought almost 500 enslaved Africans from Saint-Domingue, what is now present-day Haiti, to work on the territory's lead mines in 1720. Slavery is going to persist in the French territory when Auguste Chouteau founded the city of St. Louis in 1764. People of African descent, along with enslaved Native Americans, worked as forced laborers in a variety of capacities: agricultural laborers, blacksmiths, cooks, and personal servants. Next slide, please. One more, I'm sorry. Guided by what was called the Code Noir, which you see here on the left, the rules of French slavery provided some legal protections for enslaved people. And under French and later Spanish law, some enslaved people were able to receive their freedom through a legal mechanism known as coartation. This was a legal mechanism that allowed for self-purchase or allowed for family members, friends to purchase someone out of slavery. And during the French and Spanish colonial period in Missouri and in St. Louis, there were a few people of African descent who were able to navigate life in the precarious space between slavery and freedom. One particular woman, Jeannette Fourchet, was a former slave in French Illinois country, and came to St. Louis around 1765. She would be one of the city's first official landowners, obtaining a plot from city founder Pierre Laclede. As part of a small free Black community in St. Louis, she and her family are going to eke out a living in a variety of ways, such as farming, hunting, running a laundry business, practicing folk medicine, and boarding free Black laborers. We know that both of her husbands were skilled laborers, giving them more access to resources than other Black St. Louisans at the time. We also know that this also gave them access to wealth. We know this by virtue of an inventory of possessions, which you see here on the right, that was created after the death of her second husband, Valentine, in 1790. Her children inherited her possessions following her death in 1803, and one of her granddaughters, Julie, would marry a butcher and cattle dealer by the name of Antoine Labadie, who was one of the wealthiest African Americans in St. Louis before the Civil War. Jeannette and her family would be representative of a small free class of color that could own business and determine their destinies to an extent. And although existing in a society that was race-based, their physical and even sometimes their social proximity to other races ensured that they interacted and did business with different types of people. Next slide, please. Entering into the 19th century, African Americans made up nearly 20% of St. Louis's population. But yet, after the United States purchased Louisiana Territory in 1803, laws for people of color became more repressive. It actually became illegal to teach Blacks and mixed race people. More importantly, the guaranteed ability to buy oneself out of slavery or to have someone else buy them out of slavery, a right that was guaranteed by the Spanish, was removed. Next slide, please. Additionally, and maybe more importantly, slavery became more vital to Missouri's economy after the creation of the cotton gin, which you see on the left. This led to a flood of people coming from places like Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, trying to move their agricultural operations westward, hoping to get rich by growing cotton. So as a result of the changes that happened in the United States and after they acquired the Louisiana Territory, even the most enterprising free African Americans had difficulty controlling their lives, let alone achieving a measure of financial security. But while rampant poverty and marginalization restricted the ability of most African Americans to achieve a measure of financial stability in the 19th century, a small class of Black elites emerged in St. Louis before the Civil War. According to Cyprian Clay Morgan, go back to the other slide. According to Cyprian Clay Morgan, a descendant of one of the wealthier Black families in St. Louis, African Americans in the city controlled several $1 million worth of real estate in 1858. A sizable percentage of what he called the colored aristocracy were barbers, a lucrative profession in the 19th century that was almost exclusively the realm of Black men. Next slide, please. One of the more noted Black barbers in St. Louis, Robert J. Wilkinson, owned an establishment at the prestigious Planters House Hotel and was worth slightly more than $21,000 in 1858. If we adjust that for today's money, that means he was worth about $600,000 in today's money. Other Blacks, like former enslaved woman Pelagie Rutgers, made money through real estate speculation and other investments. In 1860, her net worth exceeded $500,000. In today's dollars, that's about $14.5 million. Next slide, please. The marriage of Rutgers' daughter Antoinette to barber and landowner James Thomas created one of the wealthiest Black families in America, being worth at their height about $800,000 in 1870. And because of deflation, that was also equal to about $14 million. In today's money, nothing to sneeze at. What you see on the left, you might be able to read that, but that was what we call his free Negro bond. In order to be a free person in Missouri, you had to have this insurance policy to ensure that if you got to a measure of trouble, that somebody would be compensated for your mischief or what have you. He was a very important person in Missouri. And as you can see from the obituary on the right side, he knew some very famous people, including a former president of the United States, James K. Polk. Now, while these tales of Black success are fascinating, they were not the norm. The condition of most African Americans in St. Louis lagged behind because of repressive racial policies and a lack of investment in Black communities. While you had enterprising businessmen and women, poor access to capital made it hard to create lasting and sustainable businesses that anchored large communities. St. Louis would have a variety of free people of color that straddled every imaginable social position. We talked about the Black elite, but St. Louis also contained a free Black middle and lower class that also made their living in any way they could. In an urban area like St. Louis, you would have African Americans who performed skilled labor, served as butlers, worked on boats, and ran their own establishments, like saloons. Others hired themselves out for odd jobs, and the like. Their freedom, of course, was tempered by their race. By the eve of the Civil War, the Black population in Missouri had jumped considerably. And although they constituted 10% of the state's population in 1860, there were more people of African descent living in Missouri than ever before, most of them being enslaved. Of the 114,931 Black Missourians enumerated for the 1860 census, almost 97% were held in bondage. The remaining 3% of the population were free Blacks, 3,572 of them in all, and the vast majority of them lived in St. Louis. Now, the manner in which African Americans, both free and enslaved, responded to the Civil War had almost everything to do with financial and physical security. While many narratives of the Civil War focus on Black enlistment and imply, or even directly state, that Black men joined the Union Army to emancipate the entire race, or to affirm a nascent sense of patriotism, my research demonstrates that the opposite was more than likely true. Black men, both free and enslaved, like their white counterparts, made decisions about enlistment based on their immediate needs, many of them being financial. While they were definitely concerned about the status and welfare of enslaved people across the country, many who shared their same condition, enslaved men only enjoyed the army only if it was advantageous to them financially. Many families, many men whose families were literally starving during the Civil War or in poor condition did not have the luxury to think about collective emancipation or patriotic self-sacrifice. If enlistment provided them with what they needed, freedom and a steady income, they joined the army. If there were other options, many chose to do other things, like engage in free labor.
Dr. Boyd. Dr. Boyd.
Yes, sir.
I just want to ask real quick. So we have had a couple of questions that have come in about a couple of the topics that you have just briefly touched on. Do
Yes,
you
sir.
want me to give them to you now for you to answer, or do you want to do it at the end?
Let's do it at the end.
Okay.
Let's do it at the end. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. And during the Civil War, we see that a state and regional economy moving from an enslaved labor to a free labor model. And as slavery collapsed, a number of farmers and businessmen needed to fill jobs left by those who had fled bondage. Beginning in the spring of 1863, the Union Army began to match loyal employers with formerly enslaved people who were looking for job opportunities. The Union Army helped to draw up contracts like the one we see here on the screen and oversaw the program to the extent that they could. This free labor system was successful to the point that it helped to alleviate the financial pressures of feeding and caring for Black refugees fleeing their masters during the collapse of slavery in Missouri. But for some, this labor system, this free labor system, was too successful. The proliferation of free labor jobs throughout the Midwest made it very hard, especially in the summer of 1864, to recruit Black men for the Union Army. Out of the estimated 20,000 able-bodied Black men in Missouri during the war, only about 8,400 actually served in federal regiments. Next slide, please. But enslaved men were not the only segment of the population who were circumspect about military service in relations to the financial needs. If certain segments of the enslaved community viewed federal military service unfavorably because of financial concerns, the vast majority of free Black men in Missouri rejected federal enlistment altogether, as it had been with their enslaved counterparts. Free Black men also viewed military service through the lenses of opportunity, individual need, and necessity. And although their race limited their employment prospects, free Black men, especially in St. Louis, were often able to secure steady jobs in a variety of fields during the Civil War. Black men not only found jobs as simple laborers or farmhands, but also found employment in more specialized occupations which paid more money than the Army did. Some owned businesses like saloon owner Robert Smith, tobacconist Dudley Harrison, and shoemaker R. Hill. Blacks in service occupations like Charlton Tandy, a porter, and Will Brady, a waiter, could earn enough money to provide for their families. Some African Americans, in fact, made considerable sums by working as riverboat pilots and barbers. Men like businessman Henry Clay Morgan, owner of a popular downtown shop and bathing saloon known as Clay Morgan Baths, that catered to such luminaries as Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and others, had enough discretionary income to pay a substitute to serve in his place after the War Department ordered the draft for Missouri in September of 1864. We have insight into the lives of free Blacks and their financial concerns from military records, which we see right here on the screen. Many of them did not sign up for federal service during the war, but beginning in February of 1865, those who had not enlisted in the Army were mandated by law to register with the Missouri militia. The vast majority of these men who enrolled at St. Louis were Black men who were skilled laborers or business owners. And you might be able to see some of their occupations they're highlighted on the right. Free Black men, especially in St. Louis, could earn far more than the $10 to $13 paid to African American soldiers during the war. And as a result, interestingly enough, by and large, rejected military service. Next slide, please. So because the federal Army paid considerably less than some Black skilled and unskilled laborers could earn in a month, free Black men may have actually seen enlistment during the Civil War as a financial burden. And we know this to be true by virtue of the more than 3,000 Black men who were forced to enroll several months before the Civil War ended. We can also see these concerns about a soldier's pay in a letter from a Black barber and a business owner to the head of Union operations in Missouri. You might not be able to read it, this handwriting, but I'll read it to you. It says, "I think that I am sufficiently patriotic to go into the ranks, but a young family who are dependent on me for support could not live upon the pay that is paid to a private. If nothing could be had, I should like a recruiting commission. So this barber is saying, I will not be able to take care of my family if I'm paid like a private. If you'd like to make me an officer, a recruiter, and pay me a decent wage, I'll be fine to affirm my patriotism and go into the army. And he implied that if he didn't get the pay that he was looking for, that he would stay working in his business. I did try to search for a response letter and to see whether he was able to get that recruiting commission. I was not able to find a response letter, and more than likely, he was not granted his wish. Next slide, please. So the Civil War changed the landscape of Missouri and the entire nation. And during Reconstruction, there was hope for a brighter social and political and economic future for African Americans. At that time, African Americans had the ability to bank with very few institutions. One was the Freedmen Savings and Trust, a financial institution established by the federal government starting in March of 1865. The St. Louis branch opened in 1868, but it shuttered its doors because of fiscal mismanagement at the national level and the economic downturn that resulted from the Panic of 1873. The failure of this bank wiped out the savings of scores of African Americans around the countries and established a feeling of distrust among African Americans regarding doing business with banks that extends to this day. Next slide, please. But at the beginning of the 20th century, African American prosperity waxed and waned in St. Louis. Extreme poverty among African Americans continued to plague the region, but you also had African American success stories. One of the most notable is that of Annie Turnbow Pope Malone. Some of you may have heard of her. Malone was born in Metropolis, Illinois, and came to St. Louis in 1902. She, like others, was concerned with notions of beauty, and as a result, founded a hair care company that she called Poro. She invented a formula to help Black women manage and grow their hair. And with a team of employees, she sold her product door to door. One of the people who will work and learn the business from Annie Malone would be Madam C.J. Walker, the woman who erroneously is recognized as the first Black millionaire. But regarding Malone, she was dogged and determined. And Malone's product became a hit and made her very wealthy. Despite the fact that white banks had refused to finance her expansion, she became a multimillionaire by 1920. Next slide, please. Malone's success allowed her to build her own manufacturing plant and stores. And additionally, she invested some of her profits into what she called Poro College, a cosmetology school for African American women. Next slide, please. Poro College also became a prime meeting space for African American social clubs and fraternal organizations like Alpha Phi Alpha, who held its closing banquet at their 1922 convention. Malone was a very important figure in Black St. Louis. Malone gave of her time and her money to worthy causes, one being what was called the Colored Orphans Home, which was located in North St. Louis. This orphans home has now been renamed the Annie Malone Children's Home. Now, the Great Depression and a contentious divorce would reduce Annie Malone's net worth, but her legacy is still seen in St. Louis with an annual parade given in her honor. The Annie Malone Parade, which usually is scheduled in May of every year, is the second largest African American parade in the country. Next slide, please. Aside from Annie Malone, there were other enterprising African Americans that skillfully navigated Jim Crow St. Louis in the early 20th century. African American entrepreneurs invested in saloons like we see here on the right, the Rosebud Bar, and funeral homes like the one we see with Harrison and McCoy here on the left. They also had other independent businesses focusing on things, next slide, like barbershops, carpentry, general contracting, newspapers, and others. These advertisements come from a defunct African-American newspaper called the St. Louis Palladium, and there were scores of ads that were issued and printed weekly. There were also other entrepreneurs who tried to make their way in Jim Crow St. Louis. But since white banks did not normally lend to African Americans, Black businessmen had to create their own finance companies. And in 1915, African American high school principal and community leader Frank L. Williams founded the first African American owned financial institution in the state of Missouri. It would be known as the New Age Building and Loan Association. Next slide, please. 8 years later, a local Black businessman founded what was known as People's Finance Corporation, catering to a mostly or exclusively minority clientele. Both of these institutions would help African Americans buy their own homes and start their own businesses. And while People's Finance Corp and the New Age Building and Loan Association were seen as a godsend to families and businesses, these small institutions did not have the resources to serve the entire African American population in St. Louis. And as such, financial stability often eluded many in the Black community. Next slide, please. Aside from challenges getting access to capital, there are also other barriers to financial success. Restrictive real estate covenants. These are agreements made between a property owner and a buyer to not sell to a particular race or ethnic group. This became commonplace in St. Louis starting in 1917 after the city voted to enforce residential segregation by law. This effectively reduced housing options for African Americans and made our city more racially divided. Redlining, that is the refusal to lend to people who live in a particular part of town because on paper, they are considered a poor financial risk. This also kept large swaths of the African American community financially stagnant and impoverished. Next slide, please. But in spite of segregation, two dynamic African American communities emerged in St. Louis in the 20th century, the Ville and Mill Creek. Now, the Ville was the most celebrated of the two. Annie Mullins Poro's College, Homer G. Phillips Hospital, and Sumner High School anchored this dynamic community. Now, I've already mentioned Poro Hospital, but both Homer G. Phillips, which we see here in these images, and Sumner High Schools were transformative community institutions. Homer G. Phillips was one of the few hospitals in the country to accept Black doctors into residency programs. And as a result, according to historian John Wright, nearly half of all Black medical residents in the United States during the time it was open came to Homer G. Phillips to complete their medical training. Let's go ahead, let's go to the next slide after that. Thank you. Now, Sumner High School, on the other hand, was an incubator of Black excellence. And when it was founded in 1875, it became the first Black high school west of the Mississippi River. Its faculty was nationally renowned and nationally recognized and consisted mostly of Black intellectuals who could not, by virtue of their race, find employment at white colleges. Next slide. One of the best examples of this was the man who we see on the right, Dr. Charles Henry Turner. Turner received a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago, graduating magna cum laude in 1907. And although he was a world-renowned animal behaviorist with 70 research papers to his credit, he was forced to teach high school students at Sumner, and he did so from 1908 to 1922. But Sumner students benefited from being taught by people like Dr. Turner and other top-notch faculty. And as a result, Sumner is going to produce a number of famous graduates. Next slide, please. Now, time does not permit me to highlight every noted Sumner grad, and you might recognize some of them here. But a few of them who we should acknowledge would be former Congressman Bill Clay, actor Robert Guillaume, tennis legend Arthur Ashe, comedian Dick Gregory, singers Chuck Berry, and yes, even Tina Turner. Next slide, please. Now, the other community that I mentioned, Mill Creek, had a history that was more working class, but no less important to the African American community. First established in the 1760s, Mill Creek was one of the first parcels of land doled out during the French colonial period. And as St. Louis expanded, so did the population of Mill Creek. As wealthier people moved away from the bustling industrial downtown after the First World War, African Americans moved in looking for decent housing. And by the 1950s, more than 20,000 people called Mill Creek home. While it was not as prestigious as the Ville, Mill Creek was a multifaceted community, and according to Bruce Olson, by 1955, it contained a vibrant mix of more than 800 African American businesses, churches, and other associations. Next slide, please. Now, while you had a Sumner High School in the Ville, there was a Vashon High School in Mill Creek. And Vashon will have a long list of famous graduates, including Congresswoman Maxine Waters, boxing champs Michael and Leon Spinks, jazz great Clark Terry, and one of the most important soul singers in musical history. And I believe he was just honored by the Grammys with a posthumous award. And that is Donny Hathaway, who you see at the bottom in the center. Now, the decline of the Ville has been connected to desegregation and suburbanization in St. Louis. But Mill Creek, on the other hand, is a completely different story. Next slide, please. Mill Creek was the victim of an urban renewal plan that demolished approximately 5,600 buildings and cleared close to 500 acres of real estate in an area just east of Midtown beginning in 1959. This was a severe hit to the African American community, both socially and financially. More than 20,000 people had to find a new place to live, and countless African American businesses had to relocate or close. And these are some of the actual notices of the businesses that had to relocate to other areas in St. Louis just to stay open. Next slide, please. Going into the 1960s, the tensions of the civil rights era led to protest, but it also led to opportunity. In 1963, after Jefferson Bank and Trust refused to hire African Americans for anything other than custodial positions, protesters marched and picketed the bank for approximately 7 months. Jefferson Bank is going to finally relent and hired 4 Black clerks in 1964, but others were not satisfied, and they believed that a better banking solution was needed for the African American community in St. Louis. Next slide, please. Though actually conceived several years before the Jefferson Bank protest, George Montgomery and a coterie of Black lawyers, doctors, and businessmen established what was called Gateway Bank in 1965, next slide, to cater to one of the most unbanked Black communities in the United States. And from 1965 until 2009, Gateway would be a pillar of North St. Louis, a predominantly Black area of the city. But despite the opportunities offered by Gateway Bank, African American entrepreneurs still struggle to find a level playing field in relation to obtaining capital to start businesses in St. Louis. Throughout the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, African Americans were routinely denied loans or were only offered loans at higher interest rates compared to their white counterparts. Barriers to financial stability stifled Black businesses and made it hard for many of them to thrive amidst increasing competition from larger companies attempting to make inroads in the Black community. Nonetheless, several African-American owned businesses flourished in the St. Louis region, defying the odds. Next slide, please. After retiring from the NFL in 1975, former middle linebacker for the St. Louis Cardinals football team, Jamie Rivers, purchased his first McDonald's franchise. Eventually, he's going to own and operate 4 very profitable franchise restaurants. And over the course of 4 decades in the business, he would employ several thousand St. Louisans. Next slide, please. Other Black business leaders came to prominence during this time as well. In 1980, oral surgeon Dr. Donald Suggs and 2 other partners became majority shareholders in the St. Louis American newspaper. This historic newspaper had been in operation since 1928, but at the time that Suggs and his partners had purchased a stake in the paper, its best days, many thought, were behind them. Suggs is going to revamp the newspaper and its business model, and by 1984, he had become the sole owner and publisher of the St. Louis American. Currently, today, Suggs has grown the paper to be the largest weekly paper in the state of Missouri. The St. Louis American has won numerous journalistic awards and is considered one of the best African-American newspapers in the United States. Next slide, please. Another African-American dentist, Dr. Benjamin Davis, would also leave his mark on St. Louis history, but by not only purchasing the first African-American owned McDonald's in East St. Louis, but by opening another McDonald's on the St. Louis side of the river. In the early 1980s, Davis opened a McDonald's on the riverfront. Some of us might remember this. Affectionately known as the McDonald's boat, it would be a favorite summer destination for St. Louisans, old and young, for more than 2 decades. And I was included in that number. Next slide. Also in the early 1980s, husband and wife duo Reuben Andy Anderson and Catherine Anderson founded Andy's Seasoning. Initially, this was a home-based business, but Andy's quickly took off, with products being placed in stores throughout the region. By 1988, they had outgrown their second location and moved into a 13,500 square foot facility on Choteau Avenue in the south side of St. Louis. Following the death of Reuben in 1996, who had run the day-to-day operations, Catherine took over, and according to Andy's Seasonings, more than doubled the size of the facility and quadrupled their profits in a very short period of time. Today's Andy's is known nationally as one of the most important food service companies in the region. Next slide, please. Into the 1990s, other African-American entrepreneurs would see even greater success. Colonel Jimmy Williams, another McDonald's success story, received his first job at the age of 16, working at the McDonald's, ironically owned by Dr. Benjamin Davis. Williams, who is originally from East St. Louis, spent nearly a decade as a pilot in the Air Force. And after acquiring his first McDonald's in the late 1990s, when he retired from active duty, Williams expanded his Estelle Foods Company to include 18 restaurants. Williams currently employs 1,300 people and has an annual revenue that is in the tens of millions of dollars. Next slide, please. But no discussion about Black success in St. Louis is complete without mentioning this man here, Dave Stewart. After borrowing about $300 from a local bank in his hometown of Clinton, Missouri, Stewart hitchhiked to St. Louis in 1973 to begin a job in sales. And after a career with the Missouri Pacific Railroad, he founded a company known as Worldwide Technology in 1990. The business solutions company, which started off with a handful of employees and a modest revenue, has become one of the titans of business in the Midwest. This privately held company is now the most profitable African-American owned business in the United States. Last year, Worldwide Technology brought in $11.9 billion in revenue. Next slide, please. But despite a record of success, Black entrepreneurs in 2021 still encounter obstacles to starting businesses in St. Louis. Despite solid business plans and a track record of running profitable ventures, African-American business people still note how challenging it can be to secure loans to start or expand their businesses. In a recent interview that I conducted with Daryl Jones, who we see here of D&D Concessions, he noted that getting his business off the ground was quite challenging. Despite obtaining a loan for several $million and promptly repaying it, he had difficulty getting additional funding. With this, he decided to move away from large financial institutions, and Jones decided to work with local community banks who catered to his needs and establish a relationship that has continued with him to this very day. Currently, D&D Concessions has a stake in 80% of the restaurants and food stands at St. Louis Lambert Airport, and their portfolio is growing. Next slide, please. A similar sentiment in regards to the difficulties of establishing a business was recently echoed by Jason Wilson, the owner of Northwest Coffee and a member of the Clayton School Board in St. Louis. Wilson sought to acquire a coffee roasting company in 2012, but despite his Washington University MBA and a history of entrepreneurship, he could not obtain a business loan. His business had to be privately funded with help from friends, family members, and investors. In a recent conversation that I had with Wilson, he noted that large banks have almost completely ignored what he likes to call, quote, the urban domestic emerging market, end quote. In his conversation with me, he said this. He said, they need to get on board. And I will tell you, Mr. Wilson is doing quite well. His coffee is some of the best. If you ever visit St. Louis, please stop at Northwest Coffee Company. Although Wilson and others had to often trudge a rocky path to success, African-American men and women in St. Louis and nationwide are determined to build upon the past to make an even brighter future for themselves and their families. It's going to be the Black luminaries, both known and unknown, who will be part of a diverse coalition of forward-looking people who will help St. Louis reclaim its former glory. With this city being at a crossroads, where will you stand, Mizzou business students? Where will you stand? Will you recognize the opportunities to partner with people who will be part of the vanguard for a better and more prosperous St. Louis? Or will you lose out to those who can clearly see the writing on the wall? In many ways, past is definitely prologue. And while past returns cannot determine future gains, I would hedge my bets that there are many more Pelagie Rutgers, James Thomases, Annie Malones, Dave Stewarts, and Jason Wilsons right here in St. Louis and throughout Missouri, and they are looking to possibly do business with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Boyd. So since we're not in person, I won't do my sound effects for a round of applause, but I would just say, on behalf of True College of Business, we thank you for your time today and for your presentation. Now, I know we have some time left. I want to get to, we've had some very thoughtful questions come into the Q&A. Sure. That I want to get to. A couple are from, I want to say a couple of staff and faculty, but the majority of them are from students. So let me get going right now, and I'll blend the first two questions into one. So the first question says, cotton was not a dominant crop here in Missouri. Were the Easterners successful in establishing themselves with slavery in Missouri?
Well, Missouri is not going to have the type of success in terms of large-scale plantations that you would find farther south. cotton is not going to be the big crop. Hemp is. And still, that is still going to entice people to come from areas where probably the best parcels of land had already been taken or were probably too expensive for them to purchase. So no, St. Louis and the entire state of Missouri depended upon slavery. In St. Louis, it was an urban version of slavery, so people were not just working in agriculture, but in the 7-county region known as Little Dixie, along the Missouri River, slavery was the foundation of the economy.
Perfect. Thank you. And the next one, I'm going to, again, I'm taking a little bit of an assumption, but for part of your presentation in the earlier years, the next question is, where were the sections of African Americans inhabited in St. Louis?
Where were the sections? Where are we talking about after residential segregation is enforced?
It didn't say. It just said where were the sections, and I know you mentioned the Ville and you know, those areas.
So the Ville is in what we consider North St. Louis. Mill Creek, if anybody's familiar with St. Louis, it is around Midtown. If you know where the St. Louis University basketball arena is, where Harris Stowe is, that area was Mill Creek. It is now filled with things like Wells Fargo, other businesses, and I believe the soccer stadium, the new soccer stadium, is going to be built in that area as well.
Perfect. Next one comes from one of our students. I believe this is a student, and the question is, it's more personal for you. It says, have you ever faced discrimination when entering the workplace? If so, how did you overcome it and not let it bother you?
Wow, you want to get into some kind of existential discussion? Very personal.
We got some scholars, Dr. Boyd. We got some scholars.
Hey, I applaud them. I applaud them. I have been fortunate for those experiences to be very rare. I can give you one example. I was a financial advisor before I went back to school, and I had inherited an account, and I went out on a home visit, and you know, I'm talking like I talk how I naturally talk on the phone, but when I got there, the person opened the door, looked at me, and slammed the door in my face and said, you know, we don't want anything, please don't sell us anything. And I was not going to knock again because I didn't want something else to happen. But I went back in my car and I said, this is Miller Boyd. I was supposed to be meeting with you and your husband at 6 o'clock. I was the man at your door. And she profusely apologized, but that kind of stung. But, you know, I persist. I try to be the best person that I can. I try to lift up all people who I work with. And I have zero tolerance for racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia, whatever. And I try to inspire that type of character in my students and those who I work with, because we're all Americans, we're all people, all human beings.
Great. So the next one is, who would you consider to be the greatest hero for Black communities in Missouri?
Wow.
And I know this is more of your opinion, right, with that question.
You know, I'm not one of those people who subscribes to the idea that there's like this one Black leader that is sort of like Martin Luther King leading people to the promised land. I think there are a number of different people in different segments of the community. Dave Stewart is one, financially, Jimmy Williams. When we think about politics, a person like Tashara Jones, treasurer of St. Louis. In education, Reynaldo Anderson at Harris Stowe. But there are many people, people known and unknown, who are role models and leaders, you know, on the macro and micro level, and who make a difference every day.
So next question, what was the Panic of 1874 and why was there a panic?
It was the Panic of 1873. It was a financial crisis. It was a stock. It was a market crash. And it's been a while since I've taught that period of American history, that Reconstruction era. I want to think it had something to do with the railroad, but I cannot remember. I'm a little rusty when it comes to that financial crisis. I can tell you more about the financial crisis that resulted from Andrew Jackson basically defunding the Second Bank of the United States, which led to a financial crisis during Martin Van Buren's administration, which should have been blamed on Andrew Jackson and not his vice president and his successor.
Gotcha. Question, and was there a lot of segregation in St. Louis after the Civil War and beyond?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. St. Louis has a really fascinating history when it comes to African-American history and race relations. St. Louis is definitely considered a Midwestern city, but the state in many respects is considered sometimes the Upper South. We were one of four slave states during the Civil War that never seceded. We were called border states. And by virtue of that, slavery will remain legal until the state constitutional convention outlawed it in January of 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. So you had these areas, these urban areas like St. Louis, where they were fine with getting rid of slavery, but those urban areas, those suburban areas and rural areas like Little Dixie held on to slavery as much as they could. And even after the Civil War, there were many instances of African Americans being targeted for reprisal. I gave a presentation recently where I discussed how there were these Confederate, we call them bushwhackers, but these guerrillas who, after slavery was outlawed, and even after Lee had surrendered to Grant in April of 1865, they were still trying to force African Americans back into slavery. And really by 1863, late 1863, the institution of slavery had collapsed around the state. But they put a flyer on a local store saying that if Blacks did not go back to their old masters and work as they had previously done, they would start killing people. And about 10 days later, they did. And those type of lynchings, reprisals continued throughout Reconstruction. I think, if I remember correctly, outside of southern states, we probably had the largest numbers of racial lynchings in the country.
Wow. So, I mean, questions are still pouring in. And again, I know we got 8 minutes. So here, I'm going to skip around a little bit and ask a couple more. Some are really direct yes or no. So I'll ask this one real quick. Are the buildings like the hospital and the high school still around today? Okay,
Homer G. Phillips, the building is still around, but the hospital closed in the early 1980s under Mayor Vince Schamel. Now, Sumner, I should have mentioned, like I said, it's the oldest high school, Black high school west of the Mississippi. The local school board, because there are so few people attending St. Louis Public Schools, there are talks of shutting Sumner down. And a lot of the alums, a lot of people who are concerned with the history of preserving that history have spoken up, and they really would like to see Sumner remain open, but it's going to be very hard with the numbers pouring out of St. Louis Public Schools into other districts and into charter schools. So here, I'm going to give you 3 questions again, and then I'll let you pick which one, right? Because there's a very big one. So, okay, so this one is, I want to say, is important because it brings kind of forward what you presented on, especially from a business standpoint. So this one says, can you tell us anything about the Delmar Divide? Which that's a whole nother presentation, but so I'm gonna stick a pin in that. And then another student says, books by A.G. Gaston and David Stewart describe how to be financially successful. Are high schools assigning these books and teaching students how to achieve similar success? So wow, somebody brought A.G. Gaston, founder of, what insurance company? It wasn't Atlanta Mutual. A.G. Gaston was a big businessman in Alabama. And I can't think of the name of the insurance company. I don't think entrepreneurship is being taught in many schools, Black or white. I think that it is important for students of all races, all cultures, to be instructed in financial literacy. I think that there needs to be some innovation when it comes to curriculum. I know here at Whitfield, we do have an economics course, but that is a senior elective. But I think it would be very helpful for students. You know, I think, Lathan, you could probably remember us growing up, we had home economics class. And, you know, people have moved away from that. We had shop class. And I think those practical things, those practical classes, I think, are really important because, you know, there are some adults who don't know how to balance a checkbook if they ever use a checkbook, but don't know how to do taxes, don't know the basics of saving. And they either have to learn on their own or learn the hard way, and hopefully have to try to get themselves out of a financial hole that they might put themselves in through credit card debt and other things. So yes, it should be taught. I wish more people read people like A.G. Gaston and David Stewart, Booker T. Washington, and many others. But I think it's also incumbent upon parents and mentors to also suggest those books for students.
Okay. Two more questions, and then I know. So one, and hopefully this one is straightforward. Can you identify the oldest family or corporately headed African-American business in St. Louis?
Okay, so the one that is, I think it was celebrated for 70 years of being in business, I believe it was Collier Motors, if I'm correct. One that has been held by the same family. I believe that's Collier Motors, which is on the north side. In terms of other businesses that have remained in the same family, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I assume that there are some.
Okay, and we'll make this the last question because I know. Okay. So the question says, could you expand on what led to the demise of the Ville?
Well, so when residential segregation was put in place, people were forced to live in just two areas of St. Louis, and that did not give them the luxury of the type of homes that they wanted to build, or if they wanted, a larger sprawling property. And there were some parts of the Ville, even before its decline, that were impoverished. And I think people benefited from being in their own kind of ethnic enclaves, but also people wanted to have choice. And what happens is that when areas, places like Spanish Lake and other places, start opening up for African Americans, people try to, especially when it starts to go into a financial decline, people are trying to leave and try to keep their families safe. They're trying to find good schools, and people start to leave, and they start to go to other places, and people are scattered. And that, of course, is going to take capital and investment out of that community, and send it into a place of disrepair. And despite the history of the Ville's best days are long behind it. It would be nice to see some of those community institutions reestablished and that history preserved. But in many ways, it's a memory, and it's a sad memory. It's sad that it is just a memory because it is a wonderful one. It was a wonderful place.
Well, thank you. Go ahead. Well, thank you, Dr. Boyd. I will. A student came in and said, and this is, how can they find your research? So the last question is, have you done any research on African-American entrepreneurship in the KC area, e.g. Henry Perry, the Bryans, the Gates, etc.?
No, I have not. I am familiar with it, but that is not within the sphere of my expertise. I'm actually a Civil War historian, and my focus is on Civil War Missouri, and Kansas City during the Civil War was kind of a smaller area. Being from St. Louis and being asked to do research on Black St. Louis and Civil War St. Louis has gotten me more into the St. Louis aspect of history. But there is a great history in Kansas City, one that I would love to be more familiar with.
Well, Dr. Boyd, again, I want to just take a moment and thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing this information with us. Any parting words, or again, if you want to, where can they find your research? And again, maybe hopefully we can have you back and do a second part and have you cover the Delmar Divide.
Oh, wow. I'd have to do some more research about that. I've got several YouTube videos. One was at Mizzou in 2016, where I spoke on my dissertation research about African-American life and African-American military service, free labor, and education in Civil War Missouri. There is another recent, I did a talk last month for the African-American experience in Missouri during Reconstruction. That's on the Missouri Historical Society's website. There are a few articles out there that I've written. One, I think the most recent one that might be accessible is from the Missouri Historical Review from October of 2016. It is my hope that in the future, hopefully this summer, I'll start working on my book based on my dissertation research. But there are probably other things that are going to come up, but hopefully I'll get that book started and hopefully done shortly.
Well, we are 1 minute over. So again, Dr. Board, again, thank you. Thank you for answering my call whenever I call. Thank you for your time. And we greatly appreciate your time on this Friday.
May I say, Mizzou is very fortunate to have you. We do miss you here in St. Louis, but I know you're doing great things, and there are more great things to come.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, we are done. We have concluded the TrueLask Business Insider Series for February, African American Business and Community Development in St. Louis, 1765 to the present. So thank everybody for tuning in. We hope to see you at our next Insider Series, and have a great weekend, everyone.